Hey guys, tonight we're heading north, very north, to a place where the wind never seems to get tired, the sea is permanently annoyed, and winter lasts approximately 9 years. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe imagine a soft little fire crackling somewhere nearby, preferably inside a Viking house that is not collapsing in a blizzard. Because tonight, we're talking about how Vikings built stormproof houses with no nails and no cement, and frankly, no patience for modern building codes. Now, when people picture Vikings, they usually imagine tall, blonde warriors yelling dramatically at the sky, or rowing aggressively, or doing that thing with the axes. But what they don't picture is carpentry, which is a shame. Because if there was one thing a Viking absolutely needed, it was a house that did not blow away the moment the North Atlantic cleared its throat. And the North Atlantic clears its throat a lot. So let's gently drift back to Scandinavia, around the 8th to 11th centuries. Think Norway, think Denmark, think Sweden. Cold, windy, dark for half the year, bright for the other half. A climate that does not negotiate. If you are going to survive there, you need more than a good fur cloak and a strong opinion. You need a house that can handle horizontal rain. You need walls that do not tremble when the wind hits 60 miles per hour. And you need a roof that will not simply leave. And somehow, the Vikings managed all of that without a single metal nail holding it together. Which feels like cheating, but it wasn't. Let's start with the basics. The classic Viking home was called a longhouse because subtlety was not their architectural style. It was long, it was low, it was sturdy, and it was built to outlast your least favorite cousin. These longhouses could stretch up to 100 feet in length, sometimes even more, which in modern terms is about the size of a modest suburban lot, except instead of vinyl siding and a mailbox, you had carved wooden posts and possibly a goat wandering through the hallway. The shape was important. The walls were not straight up and down like modern houses. They bowed outward slightly, which sounds like a mistake, but it was actually genius. The curved walls helped deflect the wind. Instead of smashing directly into a flat surface, the wind would slide around the building. It's basically the architectural equivalent of shrugging. Now, the frame. This is where things get interesting. Vikings used a method called timber framing. Large wooden posts were sunk deep into the ground. These were not decorative. These were serious, heavy oak posts, the kind of wood that does not apologize. The main structural posts formed a skeleton. Think of it like ribs. Thick vertical beams connected by horizontal beams at the top. And instead of nails, they used joints, carefully carved joints. Mortise and tenon joints, to be exact, which sounds fancy, but it's really just one piece of wood carved to fit perfectly into another, like an extremely stubborn puzzle piece. The tenon is the little tongue of wood. The mortise is the slot. They slide together tightly, sometimes secured with wooden pegs. Wooden pegs, not metal, just more wood. It's like the house is holding itself together through sheer determination. And here's the beautiful part. Wood expands and contracts with moisture and temperature. Nails can loosen over time. Cement can crack. But these wooden joints actually tighten when the wood swells in damp weather. So the wetter and windier it got, the stronger the structure became, which is deeply satisfying. Now, let's talk about walls, because walls in Viking houses were not flimsy. They were thick and layered, and sometimes filled with things that would surprise you. One common method was wattle and daub. First, they wove thin branches between vertical stakes, like a giant basket wall. Then they smeared it with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Yes, dung. Before you wrinkle your nose, remember this. When dried properly, it hardens, it insulates, it seals cracks. It is, in its own earthy way, practical. and practicality was everything. In colder regions, especially in places like Iceland and Greenland, they went even further. They built turf houses, which were essentially part house, part hill. Thick blocks of sod were stacked into walls, sometimes 3 or 4 feet thick. The grass side faced outward, the roots intertwined. Over time, the walls became almost alive, green in summer, snow-covered in winter. The earth itself became insulation. Imagine sitting inside, a storm raging outside, wind screaming across the plains, and you are inside a house that is basically hugging the ground. Very cozy, very Hobbit-like, just with more axes. Now the roof. The roof was everything. If the roof failed, the house failed, and Viking roofs were not timid. They built steeply pitched roofs. This allowed snow to slide off instead of piling up and crushing the structure. Snow is heavy. Wet snow is heavier. Viking builders understood this deeply. The roof frame was a masterpiece of interlocking beams. Again, no nails, just carefully carved joints and wooden pegs. Then came the covering. In some regions, they used wooden shingles, overlapping them carefully, each one angled to shed rain. In other regions, especially in Iceland and Norway, they layered birch bark and then covered it with turf. Yes, grass roofs. The birch bark acted as waterproofing. Birch bark is naturally resistant to water. It was laid in multiple layers. Then sod blocks were placed on top. The weight of the sod actually helped hold everything down, which is important when your roof is regularly tested by angry Atlantic winds. And here's the clever part. The heavy turf roof lowered the center of gravity. It made the house harder to lift, harder to shift, harder to bully. The Vikings basically said to the wind, "Go ahead, try." Now, let's step inside. The interior was dominated by a central hearth, a long fire pit running down the middle. Smoke rose upward and escaped through a vent in the roof. Not exactly a chimney, more like a controlled gap. Which means, yes, it was smoky inside. But that smoke had benefits. It preserved the wooden beams. It discouraged insects. It dried out the structure. The roof timbers would darken over time, becoming almost black with soot, and that soot helped protect them from rot. It was accidental chemistry, or maybe not accidental. Vikings were observant. They noticed what worked. Along the walls were raised platforms, sleeping areas, covered in furs, possibly shared with a sheep if the weather got dramatic. The walls themselves sometimes had an outer layer and an inner layer, creating a cavity filled with insulation, moss, straw, wool scraps, whatever was available. The result? A house that stayed surprisingly warm. Outside, storms could rage, snow could pile up, but inside, with a steady fire and thick walls, it was bearable. Not tropical, but survivable. And that was the goal. Now let's gently float over to something subtle but important. Flexibility. A nailed structure is rigid. It resists movement. But in high winds, rigidity can be a weakness. A little flexibility allows a building to sway slightly, to absorb energy instead of snapping. Those wooden joints, they allowed micro-movements, tiny shifts. The house could breathe with the wind. It's almost poetic. And because everything was modular and jointed, repairs were easier. If a beam cracked, you could replace that section. If part of the wall rotted, you rebuilt that portion. No jackhammer required. And we haven't even talked about shipbuilders yet, because the same people building these houses were building long ships, sleek, flexible, ocean-going masterpieces. The knowledge transferred, the understanding of wood grain, of tension, of stress, of how wind and water move around shapes. Viking builders did not fight nature head-on. They shaped their homes to cooperate with it. Low profile, aerodynamic curves, heavy roofs, thick walls, deep-set posts. Stormproof, not because they were indestructible, but because they were intelligently designed. And maybe that's the real secret. No cement, no steel reinforcements, no modern adhesives, just wood, earth, grass, bark, and a lot of careful joinery. If you stand in places like rural Norway today, you can still see descendants of these structures. Stave churches, for example, built with similar timber techniques, layered wood, pegged joints, surviving for centuries, which feels quietly impressive. And as you imagine the wind sweeping across a fjord, rain tapping gently against turf, smoke curling up into a cold night sky, you start to see it. The Viking house wasn't flashy. It wasn't elegant in a palace sort of way. It was practical, grounded, stubborn, much like the people inside it. And so, as we continue drifting through this long northern night, we'll explore how these homes evolved in different regions, how they adapted to Icelandic lava fields, how they handled Greenland's merciless cold, and how a society famous for raiding monasteries was ironically very good at staying home and building something that lasted. But for now, just picture it. A long, low house, grass on the roof, thick wooden beams, firelight flickering against darkened rafters, the wind outside, loud but harmless, and inside, warmth, because even Vikings needed somewhere to sleep. All right, let's gently push the creaky wooden door open again and step back outside. The wind is still doing its dramatic North Atlantic monologue. It never really stops, it just changes tone. In part one, we settled into the basic Viking Longhouse. Timber frames, mortise and tenon joints, turf roofs, heavy enough to make gravity proud. But now, let's drift a little farther west, because once the Vikings left Scandinavia, things got creative. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland in the late 9th century, they were enthusiastic, optimistic, possibly slightly overconfident. Iceland, after all, was beautiful. Volcanic landscapes, wide valleys, endless sky, and unfortunately, not that many trees, which is a small problem when your entire architectural philosophy is builded out of wood. So they adapted. Of course they did. Vikings did not sit around waiting for ideal building supplies. They looked at the landscape and thought, fine, we'll use whatever you're offering. And what Iceland offered was turf, lots of it. Turf houses in Iceland became masterpieces of practical desperation. Instead of relying heavily on timber walls, they used stone foundations, thick, solid, unbothered by wind. Then they stacked blocks of sod, cut carefully from the earth, like giant earthy bricks. Each block was laid in overlapping patterns, almost like weaving, but with dirt. The grass roots intertwined between layers, slowly knitting the walls together. Over time, the structure became semi-living, a house that quite literally grew stronger as plants took root. It's hard to feel more grounded than living inside something that photosynthesizes. The timber they did have was used strategically. Interior support beams, door frames, roof structures, nothing wasted. Driftwood became precious. Every plank mattered. Inside these Icelandic homes, insulation was serious business. The turf walls could be several feet thick. That thickness trapped heat beautifully. Outside, the wind could scream across lava fields. Inside, the temperature remained relatively stable. Not warm in a spa-like sense, let's not get carried away, but stable, manageable, livable. And remember, these were people who measured comfort differently. Now, let's float over to Greenland, because if Iceland was challenging, Greenland was just bold. When Eric the Red led settlers there in the late 9th century, he gave it a charming name, Greenland, which is either clever marketing or the medieval equivalent of a real estate exaggeration. Greenland was cold. Even during the medieval warm period, it was not exactly beach weather. So Viking settlers leaned even harder into turf construction. Greenlandic Norse homes were low, extremely low, hugging the ground like they were personally offended by the wind. The lower the profile, the less surface area for storms to grab. They built partially into the earth, dug down, used the surrounding soil as natural insulation. The earth maintains a relatively stable temperature below the surface. Vikings might not have had thermodynamics textbooks, but they absolutely understood this principle. The roofs were layered carefully, birch bark when available, then thick sod. The weight kept everything secure. In blizzards, snow would pile up on top, and instead of being a threat, that snow added even more insulation. The house would disappear into the landscape, a soft mound under white drifts, silent, steady. Inside, life revolved around the hearth, always the hearth. Fire was survival, cooking, heating, light, social life, all of it centered on that long strip of controlled flame. The smoke would rise slowly, filtering through the roof vent. Yes, it was smoky. Yes, eyes probably watered, but the slow escape of smoke reduced drafts. A fully open chimney would suck warm air out too quickly. A simple vent kept the balance. It's almost meditative to imagine. A steady fire, thick walls, the sound of wind softened by layers of earth. Now here's something quietly fascinating. Viking houses were not built to stand forever. They were built to last long enough. Wood eventually rots, turf settles, but because they used joinery instead of nails, sections could be replaced. Communities maintained houses constantly. A sagging roof beam? Replace it. Turf deteriorating? Cut new sod. It was an ongoing relationship with the building, not a one-time construction project. In that sense, Viking homes were alive. They required attention, care, maintenance, which probably kept everyone busy during long winters. And speaking of winter, let's talk about doors. Doors were small, intentionally small. You had to duck slightly to enter, which may have been humbling for a 6-foot-tall Norse farmer, but it prevented heat from escaping too quickly. A smaller opening meant less wind intrusion. Windows? Minimal. Sometimes none at all. Glass was rare and expensive. Instead, there might be small openings covered with animal membranes or shutters. Less light, more warmth.
It sounds dark, but remember, Viking daily life followed the seasons. In winter, the world outside was already dim. The house became a cocoon, a protective shell. And let's not forget the floor, often packed earth, sometimes covered with wooden planks in wealthier homes. The earth floor absorbed some heat from the hearth and released it slowly. In especially cold regions, they sometimes layered straw for insulation, straw that could be replaced, renewed, refreshed. There's a pattern here. Everything renewable, everything repairable. Now drift back to Scandinavia for a moment. In Norway, where forests were abundant, some structures became more elaborate. Raised wooden buildings, storehouses on stilts to keep food safe from moisture and rodents. Even these used pegged joinery, interlocking beams, precision carving, no metal necessary. Metal was expensive. iron had to be smelted, shaped, reserved for tools and weapons. You wouldn't waste it on something wood could handle perfectly well, and wood handled it very well. It's almost amusing to imagine a modern contractor explaining rebar and concrete to a Viking builder. The Viking would nod politely, then gesture toward a 300-year-old timber structure still standing through countless storms. Results speak quietly. There's also something deeply environmental about it all. Viking homes were built entirely from local materials: wood from nearby forests, turf from the surrounding land, stone from the ground underfoot. If a house was abandoned, it eventually returned to the earth, decomposed, blended back into the landscape. No plastic, no synthetic sealants, just a slow, natural fade. Archaeologists today often find only faint outlines, a depression in the ground, post holes, a scatter of stones. The house dissolves, but the pattern remains. And in that pattern, you can read intention, intelligence, adaptation. So when we say Vikings built stormproof houses with no nails or cement, it isn't just a fun historical trivia fact. It's a story about understanding materials, about reading climate, about shaping shelter that works with nature instead of arguing with it. They didn't try to overpower the wind. They lowered themselves beneath it. They didn't fight the cold with brute force. They layered earth and air and fiber until warmth lingered. And as we slowly continue through this long northern evening, we'll drift into how social life shaped these houses, how entire families and sometimes livestock shared that warm interior, how status could be measured in beam size, and how architecture reflected a society both practical and quietly proud. But for now, just imagine it again. A turf-covered roof under moonlight, thick earthen walls, a small doorway glowing faintly from firelight inside. The storm can do whatever it likes. The house is not impressed.
All right, the wind is still howling politely outside. The turf roof is holding. The walls are doing their thick, dependable thing. So let's finally stay inside for a while. Because a Viking house was not just a structure, it was a living, breathing ecosystem of people, animals, smoke, noise, and the occasional mild emotional breakdown. The Longhouse was long for a reason. It wasn't just one cozy nuclear family sipping herbal tea. It was extended family, workers, guests, maybe a wandering relative who just needed a place to stay for the winter and never quite left. Privacy, as we understand it, was not really on the menu. When you stepped inside, the first thing you noticed was the hearth. Always the hearth. A long fire pit running down the center of the building. Flames low and steady. Smoke curling upward, drifting lazily toward the roof vent. It was warmest near the center, naturally, so the most important people often sat closest to the fire. Status had a temperature gradient. Along both walls were raised wooden platforms. These served as benches during the day and beds at night, covered in animal furs, wool blankets, possibly your cousin's elbow. Above these platforms, wooden beams stretched across the length of the house, thick, darkened by years of smoke. And here's where the clever design shines again. Those beams weren't just holding up the roof, they were distributing weight evenly along the frame, every joint carefully carved, every peg precisely placed. The structure wasn't stiff like modern framing. It had give. It flexed slightly under pressure. When winter storms pushed against the walls, the house responded with subtle movement, a quiet creak, a soft shift, nothing dramatic, just wood acknowledging wind, almost like a conversation. Now, let's talk about the animals, because yes, in many Viking longhouses, livestock lived under the same roof as humans. Charming, right? Cows, sheep, maybe goats, were often housed in a separate section of the longhouse, usually at one end. There might be a low partition, but the warmth they generated was incredibly useful. A cow is basically a large, slow-moving radiator. During brutal winters, having animals inside meant additional heat. It also meant smells. But again, survival tends to adjust your tolerance levels. And the building design accounted for this. The thick turf walls absorbed odors, the slow movement of smoke helped with airflow. The small roof vent allowed enough ventilation without letting precious heat escape too quickly. It wasn't pristine, but it worked. And that word keeps coming up. Now, wealthier Vikings, particularly chieftains, had larger and more elaborate longhouses, bigger beams, more intricate carvings, decorative high seat pillars near the main sitting area. The high seat was symbolic. It marked authority. And structurally, it was often reinforced with some of the strongest timber in the building. Even status had structural support. In some cases, the roof ridge might feature carved dragon heads or ornamental details. Not purely decorative, though. These carved pieces often capped structural joints, protecting exposed wood from moisture. Beauty serving function, function disguised as beauty. And let's not forget storage. Viking houses were organized carefully. Hooks and pegs lined the walls, tools hung within reach, weapons stored safely but accessibly. Wooden chests held clothing and valuables. These chests were portable. If needed, they could be loaded onto ships. The joinery techniques used in house construction were mirrored in furniture design. Interlocking pieces, no nails required. Because metal was precious. Iron was for swords, and maybe the occasional tool. But your house relied on craftsmanship. Now, here's something quietly brilliant. Many Viking houses were built slightly curved along their length, not dramatically, just enough to distribute stress. A straight line can split under pressure. A subtle curve deflects it. The wind hits and slides along instead of plunging directly inward. It's almost as if the building sighs and lets the storm pass. And the roof support system was equally thoughtful. Pairs of curved beams, known today as cruck frames, rose from the walls and met at the ridge. These created a strong arch-like structure. Arches are powerful shapes. Even without cement, they distribute weight beautifully. Snow piling on top, the arch parries it down and outward. Wind pressing sideways, the curve absorbs it. It's structural calmness.
Now, imagine daily life unfolding inside this carefully balanced shelter. In the early morning, before sunrise in winter, someone stirs the embers in the hearth, adds wood, coaxes the flame back to life. Light flickers across the smoky ceiling. The walls, thick with turf and timber, keep the cold at bay. Outside, frost coats the landscape. Inside, breath hangs briefly in the air before warming. Children move slowly from their furs. Adults begin quiet tasks, mending nets, carving wood, preparing food. The architecture supports this rhythm. The long central space allows for communal activity. The platforms provide seating. The beams overhead allow hooks for drying fish or hanging tools. Nothing wasted. Every surface has a purpose. And because the house was so durable, families often lived in the same structure for generations. Repairs were constant, but manageable. The skeleton of the building endured. Sometimes, when archaeologists excavate longhouse sites, they find evidence of rebuilding directly on top of older foundations. Same location, same orientation,
just a refreshed version. The house evolves, but the footprint remains. There's something deeply human about that. And here's another quiet design feature. Entrances were often positioned away from prevailing winds. If the strongest winter storms came from the northwest, the door would face southeast. It seems obvious, but it requires awareness, observation over years. Vikings were farmers, sailors, traders. They understood weather patterns intimately. Their houses reflected that knowledge. Even the placement within a settlement mattered. Homes were often clustered to block wind for one another, positioned strategically along slopes, sometimes partially shielded by natural rock formations. Architecture blending with landscape. No cement, no modern sealants, just placement, weight, shape, and joinery. As we gently continue drifting through this smoky, firelit interior, it becomes clear that Viking houses were less about dominating nature and more about negotiating with it. They bent when needed. They thickened where necessary. They settled into the earth instead of towering above it. And in doing so, they created structures that could survive decades of storms, snow, and shifting climates, all without a single metal nail holding it together. Just wood, earth, fiber, thoughtfulness. So tonight, as the imaginary wind hums outside our imaginary turf-covered roof, picture that longhouse again. The beams steady, the hearth glowing, the walls thick and patient. A shelter built not with force, but with understanding. And in the quiet creak of timber meeting wind, you can almost hear it say, calmly, confidently, "I've handled worse."